Hey guys, what's going on? It's MajiinBae. Welcome back to the channel. Today, no gameplay. We're just going to be talking about ladder and the best standard decks and all that kind of stuff. As you can see, I'm currently rank 11, 756 LP. Rank 1 is 1,000 LP. This is actually my second take, and it was 980 something before, so congratulations, Lip, on winning your last game. So I have been playing quite a bit of ladder recently, as you can see by my rank, but most of this was actually gained in the last few days. It went from like 250, 300, all the way up to 750, which you see now. And I think that's because I decided to play the good decks. I figured out what's actually good, and I really just focused on those, namely one deck, which I think is one of two really, really good choices. But we'll talk about that in a second. There's a couple of different ways to go about this. If you're lower rank, you can kind of play whatever you want. If you're a bit higher rank, like if you're in Masters or whatever, and you really want to be pushing for like front page, top 25 for world points, what have you, I think that one of these decks that I'm going to recommend to you is going to be better than your other options. So without further ado, let's get into the list. Number one, first deck that I think is probably the single best deck right now in the game is Fizz Samira. A couple different versions floating around. I think you should be on Shelly Burblefish. I think you should be on 0 copies of the newly nerfed Powder Pandemonium. And I have a couple copies of Jagged Butcher. You absolutely don't need this. But at the hours I was playing, there was a lot of Jinx Kennen going around, and making sure that I had an early blocker, especially a 3-3, to shut 2 attacks down was a really big deal. It also chump blocks Nasus the first time before he levels, and that was kind of nice. But if you're not familiar with this deck, basically what you do is you're looking to get your champs like Fizz Samira, and you're going to play a kind of tempo-y burn plan. You're very, very, very tempo positive with your plunder effects. You have Father Fury, you have Pirouette, right? Barb Chain and Swindle are really, really good spells to cycle into more spells, and Shelly cares about that. Shelly really, really likes having spells. Shelly needs a couple things to, I think 3 things, namely to really take advantage of a game, and that's spells, obviously, units to get the pumps, and then you need a little bit of tempo. Because if you're behind, Shelly won't really catch you up, but if you're ahead, Shelly can absolutely slam the door in your opponent's face. And Coral Creatures gives you all 3 of those. I absolutely love Coral Creatures in all decks, honestly. It's one of my favorite cards in the entire game, but I really, really love it in this one. Outside of Bloodbait, basically every Noxus Bilgewater hit is really good. Even Jettison is good in this deck, because that's how good 1 mana burst do nothing is, because of things like Shelly, because of Samira, and because of Wiggly Burblefish. Eventually, you get to a point where you just have this very strong board. You flip Samira, maybe you have a Shelly, blah, 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 blah. You vomit out a bunch of dudes, you make them all big, and you rally because of Samira, and your opponent explodes. That's how the deck works. Now, in a lot of matchups, specifically matchups with the removal, you're going to look really, really hard for Fizz plus Stylish Shot, because Fizz is going to give you a little bit of early pressure. Stylish is going to be a continuous enabler for Fizz to get elusive. That's also pushing damage. It's making your Burblefish cheaper. It's pumping your Shelly. It's helping your Samira level. It's turning on Plunder for your all-out, so you don't have to waste your Flare or whatever it's called, right? Stylish Shot plus Fizz is the single most important thing if you're playing against a slower deck with removal. This could be Nasus. This could be Dark Donger, Jace Heimerdinger. If, Karma Set, you're going to see a lot of those, and those are the starts you want. I've been very happy with the rest of the list. I recently cut 2 copies of Inferna and changed them for 2 copies of Eye of Nonkaboros, which I actually like a lot more. Inferna's pretty fragile. It seems like it's kind of easy for her to die. She feels awkward to develop. If you do develop her and she doesn't die, she basically wins you the game, and that's super awesome. But you could say the same thing for Samira, Shelly, right? And a lot of times with this deck, I just need cards, and I need them now. And Eye of Nonkaboros gives us that. I often just want to draw more cards. That's all I ever want to do with this deck, and Eye of Nonkaboros lets us do that. Try not to waste your Plunder enablers when you don't have to, especially things like Stylish Shot and Warning Shot, because they're one-offs. You'll usually find me using Flare as my Plunder enabler of choice when I'm not attacking, otherwise it'd be Stylish Shot. Don't be afraid to Pirouette just to deal 1 and stun. This can be a really, really big tempo enabler. It turns on your plunder effects. It pushes the blocker out of the way. It can set up for all sorts of really strong plays. So always be the lookout on for that. I think like I mentioned, I think this is the single best deck in Standard right now. That is subject to change. There are some matchups that are like not super great, but the reason why I think it is such a good deck is because there's nothing that I'm like, oh my god, we got countered, right? Like the worst matchups are probably like Jinx Kennen, the Bandle City one, maybe Alawi Swain, right? It's basically just like Jinx Kennen that I don't want to see, and I win those all the time. It's your matchups go from super duper favored to maybe not favored, and that's about as far as it goes. And that's why I really think if you want to climb as high as possible, Fizz Samira is probably the best deck. Now if you're just like, you know what, I just don't like Fizz Samira, I think Fizz is poopy and I hate this picture of him, that's totally fair. I get that. So the next deck that I have recommended is Jinx Cannon, the counter to Fizz Samira. This is probably just as good as Fizz Samira, if we're being honest, but I don't think you get quite as many free wins. But man, this deck is very, very powerful. Very powerful. With the super quick aggro start of things like Forge Chief, you know, the Boom Baboon, Zanai Urchin engine. Returnal Wrench giving you constant value for things like Electro Harpoon, Zanai Urchin, Squeaker, Rummage, Blowback, Partsman Holt. Like just an insane addition to this archetype, honestly. If you're not familiar with this deck, the deck plays Kennen specifically because it's a 2-1 quick attack for 1, which is pretty solid. But the Mark of the Storm is a discard fodder. So a lot of times you'll play Kennen on turn 2 into Zanai Urchin, or you'll play it on turn 3 and you'll Electro Harpoon, or you get it, right? Anything like that. You just use it as a free card to discard, and that it's honestly pretty powerful. Jinx needs no introduction. If you played Runeterra for any amount of time, you know how Jinx works. You know what she does. You know what she brings to the table. Blowback and Electro Harpoon being like incredibly powerful burn tools that are able to remove blockers from the board and also deal damage directly to your opponent's Nexus, pulling huge double duty. I was definitely off about this card in my initial review. Blowback is very powerful. I've been very impressed with this deck. I think it's really good. I think in the hands of an experienced pilot, it's going to be very strong, even against decks that are supposed to like be quite good against it, right? Dark Donger, Jace Heimerdinger Shadow Isles, is supposedly supposed to be good against these aggressive decks with things like Quietist, Soul Harvest. It can make units on the board pretty easily, but I don't know. I don't know, man. I think Kennen Jinx is maybe just a little bit too strong for the Shadow Isles tools, and that's what you want. If you have an aggro deck and the Shadow Isles decks aren't very good against it, then that's exactly where you want to be. And so I think Kennen Jinx, absolutely one of the top dogs. You really should be considering this. I think both Kennen Jinx and Fizz Samira are maybe going to be the two best decks in the Open tournament as well, so something to keep in mind. And I think both of these could absolutely carry you to rank 1. Now, a deck that I think is really strong at lower rankings, I wanted to give you guys one of these, is the Nasus Vaults deck. This deck can be a bit clunky, and it's definitely soft to Fizz Samira, and I think it's a little bit soft to Jinx Kennen as well. Maybe, honestly, not really sure, but I feel like it kind of is a little bit. However, what this deck brings to the table is it just absolutely kicks every other mid-range deck in the teeth. Like, this deck is just so much value and so much pressure. It is so difficult to deal with it if you're playing Jace Heimerdinger, any board-based deck, right? Vaintrox hates this deck. Hates to see this deck. The Vaults engine, if you're not familiar with what this deck does, basically, on round start, it kills your most expensive ally to summon something from your deck that costs 1 more. Birthing Pod, if you played Magic the Gathering, basically, but not voluntary. And you basically use Rockbear Shepherd to get Hibernating Rockbear, and it sacks it, and it goes and gets Nasus. If you have Rockbear Shepherd and Vaults of Helia, it will sack Rockbear Shepherd to get Vhagar, giving you a Darkness, starting to pump up your Darkness. This comes into play later. Then it will sack the landmark, get Nasus. Nasus slays, like Vaults of Helia activations count towards your Nasus slays. Then later, after you get Rekindler, it'll sack Nasus to bring Rekindler, giving you Nasus. It'll sack Rekindler to give you Destinator. Your Darkness is already pumped up because you already had a Vhagar on board. Like, insane. You bring with it the traditional Shadow Isles control stuff, Quietus, Hate Spike, Soul Harvest, Vengeance, and what's really important right now is Quicksand. Quicksand is a must bring if you're planning on playing a meta where there's things like Teemo, right? Teemo Puffcaps. Elusives are still a very powerful player. Samira Fizz. I've been saying on stream when I'm playing Samira Fizz in this Nasus matchup that the first check is, do they have the thing? Are they doing the Vaults of Helia thing? Okay, cool. Do they have Quicksand? If no, they're dead. If yes, well, then we have a real game on our hands. I really recommend bringing 2 copies of Quicksand. 3 is probably a little overkill, but 2 is like very good. Gets to play Rite of Negation. This is more of a proactive Rite of Negation. It's usually used to defend its own threats than it is to stop your opponent doing anything, because what you're doing is pretty powerful, right? You don't care if your opponent gets like a champion strength if your Nasus is a 2020 and you have a bunch of random stuff on board, but it can still be nice. And then we're gonna talk about Glory's Call. Glory's Call is a burst card, costs 1 less, or sorry, 2 less for each ascendant you played. I think it's actually 6 mana now. Maybe? No, it's 5? Whatever. You get to manifest a card from the Emperor's deck with cost 9 or less. Those are super powerful and super underrated. So when you get Nasus out, this goes down to 3, right? And then if you vaults into Azir, or you just manage to find an Azir who's like not bad on stat wise, right? It's just a 1/5 for 3. That's pretty solid. Then all of a sudden this Glory's Call costs 1. And the cards you can get off Glory's Call are very, very powerful. You can do stuff like at burst speed, create an ephemeral rekindler, which will summon another Nasus that's not ephemeral. And you can do that before you open attack without even giving your opponent priority. You can get the 9 cost card that obliterates 3 different things. You can get the 7 mana Dude with Barrier that fights something into the end of every turn. Or you can just take the 2 mana Fearsome Guy that draws a card. You can take Pot of Greed, right? Like, the options for the Emperor's deck are rather varied and very strong. So I think this deck does suffer a bit at the higher ranks, like I said, because there's going to be a plethora of like Fizz Samiras and a couple other decks that maybe look to take advantage of Nasus. It is a very popular strategy after all. However, I think even in like lower masters, I think this deck is going to be crushing people, especially in below masters. People are going to bring a lot of decks that just can't quite punch above their weight, and Nasus gets really, really big, and people will not be prepared to deal with it. If you've never tried this deck, I recommend that you do, because I think it's really cool. I like vaulting into gigantic Nasus and then Nasus bonking everything is just a really good time, and I really think you should try it. So those are the 3 decks that I would pick to climb if I were giving advice to any random YouTube watcher. Let me know in the comments if you guys think there are other decks that I should have covered, or that maybe I should cover in a future video. Maybe you don't like a particular build that I picked out. Let me know down there. I'll be checking them out throughout the day. Anyway, thank you guys so much for coming. I'll see you next time.